Consumer Reports revealed the results of an investigation they carried out where they looked at dozens of chocolate products, including milk chocolate, dark chocolate, cocoa powders, and others. And they basically found that every chocolate product they looked at contained detectable levels of heavy metals, like lead or cadmium. And many products, including some big brands, had more heavy metals crossed a threshold of safety that they established. So this made all the headlines, and understandably, it created a ton of panic. And that's understandable because these heavy metals like lead and cadmium are potentially toxic with chronic exposure, especially in children. But the question is, how much? What is the dose? Because they're naturally present in the environment. So some level of exposure is normal and inevitable. Even when we're eating, even healthy foods contain measurable levels of lead and other heavy metals. And the thresholds decided by Consumer Reports were extremely conservative. This is the takeaway here. And some people argue they were unreasonably conservative. Basically, Consumer Reports decided as their threshold the levels from Prop 65, or Proposition 65, which is a law from California. But as we covered in the protein powder video, Prop 65 levels are for labeling purposes. They're not safety thresholds. And just because a product crosses the threshold for Prop 65 doesn't mean the product becomes toxic. In fact, those values from Prop 65 are defined by looking at the dose at which we start seeing health issues and then dividing that by 1,000. So there's a massive margin of safety. So as an example, the FDA has a cutoff for lead that is actually meant for health safety, and for young children it's 4 times higher than the Prop 65 cutoff, and for women of childbearing age it's 17 times higher. In Europe they have a cutoff for cadmium and it's 5 times higher than the Prop 65 cutoff. So just bear that in mind as we go through the results. The cutoffs that Consumer Reports decided on are extremely conservative. Okay, so what products were safer and which were more contaminated? Ironically, dark chocolate and cocoa powder, which are the healthiest forms of chocolate because they contain the highest amounts of flavonols, which are these phytonutrients that confer a lot of the health benefits of chocolate, they also contain the most heavy metals. And that's because both the heavy metals and the flavonols accumulate in the same part of the cocoa bean, which is the solids, the cocoa solids. And because dark chocolate and cocoa powder are higher in cocoa solids, they have more heavy metals, whereas milk chocolate or candy bars, those products have a lower concentration of cocoa solids, so they have less flavonols, they're generally considered less healthy, but they also have less heavy metals. So it sounds like everything's against us, right? The gods just don't want us to be healthy. The exact part of the food that confers the benefit also accumulates the heavy metals. What are we supposed to do? Well, fortunately, there are exceptions because cadmium is taken up by the cacao plant, the plant that gives rise to the cocoa beans, through the roots. So cadmium will be in the soil if the soil is contaminated, and the plant takes that up and it ends up in the cacao beans, whereas lead gets in the beans during the processing stages. So this means that depending on the characteristics of the soil, the chocolate will have higher or lower levels of cadmium. And depending on the characteristics of the processing steps, it will have higher or lower levels of lead. And in fact, we see this in the results. They vary a lot. So starting with the brands that had too much cadmium, according to Consumer Reports, 8 products. Some of the big brands in here include Lindt, this 70% cocoa bar, and a Dove Promises Deeper Dark Chocolate, also 70% cacao content. And notice that in both cases, the level of cadmium is just over the threshold, 116%, 112%. And as we said, these are very strict cutoffs. And by the way, I think they're using cacao and cocoa interchangeably here. Sometimes cacao refers to the earlier version before roasting and cocoa after roasting during the processing of chocolate. But I think here they're using both to refer to cocoa. I think all of them are roasted. So that's the bars that were high in cadmium. Now the bars that are high in lead. 10 products, including some big brands, Godiva, Signature Dark Chocolate, 72% cacao, a Lindt bar as well, 85% cocoa, a Trader Joe's, 72% cacao, and a Hershey's Special Dark Mildly Sweet Chocolate. This Hershey's bar has the highest content of lead, 265, so about 2.6 times that threshold they defined. And just to point out real quick, this Hershey's bar is something that I normally wouldn't encourage anyway because it is Dutched, it is processed with alkali, which gets rid of a lot of the flavonols, so it kind of beats the purpose of eating dark chocolate. And we covered all these details, the processing and the best and the worst forms of dark chocolate in the chocolate video from last week. In case you missed that, I'll link that in the description. And then they had 5 bars that were high both in lead and cadmium. There's a Trader Joe's here where the lead is just over, but the cadmium is about twice the threshold. And in addition to lead and cadmium, they also tested arsenic, but none of the products were too high in arsenic. Also, they looked at organic products, and they were just as likely to have similar levels of heavy metals. So just choosing something organic doesn't work. Now, they singled out 5 products that were under their cutoffs for both lead and cadmium. So there's this Mast organic dark chocolate, 80% cocoa, Taza chocolate, organic deliciously dark chocolate, 70% cacao, Ghirardelli's intense dark chocolate, 86% cacao, Ghirardelli, another one, 72% cacao, and this Valrhona Albinau dark chocolate, 85% cacao. So these were the 5 bars that they found under the threshold for both heavy metals. This was the first investigation they carried out. Later, they carried out a second one where they looked at more products. And they found 2 more dark chocolates that were under the cutoff for both lead and cadmium. It was this Sam's Choice from Walmart, 85% cocoa, and this Divine, 70% deliciously smooth dark chocolate, and then a bunch of others that they consider too high. This Perugina down here kind of stands out. The lead was 5 times their cutoff. And this is a level where I could see this becoming an issue in some cases with more susceptibility, like small children, for example, with chronic intake. They also tested 5 milk chocolates in the second investigation, and all of them were under the cutoff for both heavy metals. And that includes a Lindt and a Hershey's and a bunch of other brands. They looked at some chocolate chip cookies, and most were under the cutoffs as well, only a couple exceptions. Bear in mind, though, the serving here is 1 tablespoon, so this could add up if people are having a lot. They looked at cocoa powder products, and most are under the cutoff, which is interesting because cocoa powder is more concentrated in cocoa than dark chocolate. So this speaks to that variability we were talking about. One brand that they single out is Navitas Organics Cacao Powder, which had the lowest content of heavy metals. And it seems they third-party test all their products. So it seems they're pretty careful. And then they had hot chocolate mixes. Several were over the cutoffs, although a couple were just over. Only one exception that was frankly over. And finally, brownie mix and cake mix products, and most were safe. There's another independent organization called As You Sow that also carried out a similar investigation with looking at chocolate products, but they also used the same cutoffs for Prop 65. And this investigation was really big, like hundreds of products, too many to go through without putting you guys to sleep, but I'll link this below. You can go through and check your favorite brands. Bottom line, the milk chocolates were mostly under threshold, and the dark chocolates, most were over these cutoffs with some exceptions. So in addition to the ones we already talked about, Ritter Dark, chocolate 81% cacao, extra intense, Hershey's 100% cocoa, Ghirardelli 100%, and this Sam's Choice 90% cocoa. So even by this very strict standard, they still found a number of brands that were under. One caveat to bear in mind in general is that this depends on the batch. So even if one brand has a certain result, years later, it could change depending on, again, the soil and the processing and all these characteristics. In addition to these investigations by these more public-facing organizations, there's been a number of studies published in peer-reviewed scientific journals looking at chocolate products as well. So one study published last year looked at 72 chocolate products. They found that 43% exceeded the Prop 65 cutoff for lead, but when we compare it to the FDA limits, the FDA cutoffs, then 97% were under. So again, here you see the difference between these thresholds. These guys also found that organic wasn't any better. In fact, they found organic was more likely to have higher levels of cadmium and lead. And a second study published last year also had a number of very interesting findings. For example, they found that the origin of the chocolate, where it's grown, made a big difference. So chocolate from Central and South America had more heavy metals. Chocolate from West Africa and Asia had less. They also explained that dark chocolate is rich in a number of nutrients like copper, iron, manganese, magnesium, and zinc, and these can restrict the absorption of heavy metals like cadmium and lead. So this means that the level of lead, for example, in the dark chocolate doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to absorb it and have it in our system. This study concluded that cadmium and lead levels in nearly all chocolates are below recommended safe limits, and 1 ounce daily of dark chocolate poses no health concern for adults, with only minor concern for cadmium in children. One thing to point out is that these cutoffs that we've talked about, they're for total daily exposure. So all the diet added up, plus any other exposure. When you're pumping gas, everything added up, right? So the products that were highest, for example, if added on top of an already significant exposure, they could cross some of the thresholds. So that's something to bear in mind. Although bear in mind also, this is for chronic exposure, day in and day out, not for occasional intake. So the bottom line here is I think these results were a little overblown. The Consumer Reports findings by the media were a little exaggerated. I wouldn't say completely irrelevant, because I think it's possible for special vulnerable groups like a small child, or during pregnancy, or if you have a special condition like kidney disease, for example, you can't excrete these metals normally. I think it's possible with regular consumption, a substantial amount, especially of these brands that have the highest levels of lead, or even if it's a healthy adult but consumes a very large amount, an unusual amount, regularly every day, I think it's possible that an issue could arise. But for most healthy adults, consuming usual doses, 1 ounce of dark chocolate a few times a week or even daily, and 1 ounce is about 35 grams for the metric folks, which is about a third of a full-size bar. So a full-size bar is about 3 ounces, or some cocoa powder a few times a week or even daily, not an issue with most brands in the market. When we talked about the protein powder results, I think that was already a little overblown, and I think here it's even more overblown because the levels of heavy metals here are lower. And even if you want to play extra safe and you want to stay under even the most conservative thresholds, the Prop 65 cutoffs, there's still a number of brands that allow you to do that. If you missed our video on protein powders and heavy metals, I'll link that right here. Check it out, and I'll see you in there.